The land office in Laramie, Wyoming smelled like pine resin, old paper, and the particular kind of desperation that arrives when a person has nothing left to lose. It was the summer of 1878, and the afternoon heat pressed down on the town like a boot heel on a snake, relentless and suffocating. Calvin Reed had been sitting behind the long oak counter for 3 hours, processing claims, stamping documents, watching men arrive with their hats in their hands and their futures folded into their breast pockets, and not one single soul had surprised him, until she walked through the door. She was not especially tall, and she was not wearing anything that should have commanded attention. A plain calico dress, dusty from the road, a wool traveling coat that had seen better decades, and a hat with a brim that dipped low over dark eyes that were already scanning the room like a hawk mapping a field. She carried a leather satchel under one arm, and she walked directly to the counter without looking at any of the 3 men who were already waiting on the bench along the wall, which broke every unspoken rule of frontier courtesy and order. Calvin set down his pen. He said, "Ma'am, there's a line." She said, "I am aware of the line. But those 3 gentlemen are here about homestead claims, and this matter pertains to a fraudulent prior filing, which supersedes the standard queue under the General Land Office Regulations of 1862, Section 14, Subsection C. I believe you'll find that distinction applies." The room went absolutely silent. Calvin had processed land claims for 6 years, first in Colorado and now in Wyoming Territory. He had dealt with lawyers, railroad agents, cattle barons, and at least 2 men who had arrived at the counter with loaded revolvers visible on their hips as persuasive supplements to their paperwork. Not once, not a single time in 6 years, had any person walked into his office and cited specific federal land regulations from memory at him. He said, "I'm going to need you to repeat that." She opened the satchel, laid a document on the counter and said, "My name is Jane Baker. My father, Thomas Baker, filed a homestead claim on 320 acres north of the Laramie River in April of 1875. That claim was registered, approved, and the 5-year improvement period was well underway when a man named Douglas Hargrove filed a competing claim on the same land in February of 1878, citing abandonment. My father has not abandoned that land. He is sick. He is bedridden in a house he built with his own hands on the land in question, and this office processed Hargrove's claim without a single inspection, without notifying my father, and without following a single step of the required procedure. I would like to know how that happened. I would like to know who authorized it. And I would like to know what you intend to do to correct it, because if the answer to any of those 3 questions fails to satisfy me, I will be writing a very detailed letter to the General Land Office in Washington, and I will be including the name of every clerk, deputy recorder, and supervisor in this office." Calvin looked at the document she had placed on the counter. He looked at her face. Her eyes were dark brown, nearly black, and they were not angry exactly. Anger implies heat. What was in her eyes was colder and more precise than anger. It was conviction. It was the particular expression of someone who has spent a very long time being right about something that powerful people have been pretending she is wrong about, and who has run completely out of patience. He picked up the document. He said, "Give me a moment." He turned to his files. He found Thomas Baker's original claim from 1875. He found the 1878 filing by Douglas Hargrove. And then, with a feeling that started somewhere in his stomach and worked its way up into his chest like cold water rising, he found the notation in the margin of Hargrove's application. It was in the handwriting of his supervisor, a man named Gerald Whitmore. It said simply, "Approved, expedite," and beside it, faint but unmistakably present, was a small penciled $sign. Calvin had worked for Gerald Whitmore for 2 years. He had noticed things. He had chosen, each time, to look at the next file and move on. He had told himself it was none of his business, that he was a clerk, not a judge, that the machinery of government was larger than any one man's suspicions. He had told himself a great many things. Standing here now, with Jane Baker's eyes fixed on him from across the counter, a document proving his supervisor had taken a bribe in exchange for processing a fraudulent land claim sitting in his hands, he realized that every one of those things he had told himself was a coward's lie. He set the file on the counter between them. He said, "Miss Baker, I owe you an apology on behalf of this office. This claim was processed incorrectly." The notation here indicates it was approved without an inspection, which is a direct violation of procedure. I want to be honest with you about what I can do and what the limits of my authority are, and then I want to tell you what I intend to do beyond those limits because I believe you deserve a full accounting. She had been braced for an argument. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way they were drawn back and slightly forward, ready to push against resistance. When he said those words instead of the resistance she had anticipated, something shifted in her posture. It was subtle. The shoulders dropped the smallest fraction of an inch. The jaw unclenched. She said, "I am listening." That was the moment Calvin Reed understood he was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble that comes from a supervisor who may have taken a bribe. Not the kind that comes from fraudulent land claims or federal regulations, or any of the many serious and complex problems that had just arrived in his office, along with the woman on the other side of his counter. He was in trouble of a different, more permanent, and far more inconvenient variety. He had been felled on the spot by a woman arguing land law at him, and he was completely aware of how ridiculous that should have sounded, and he did not care at all. Jane Baker had arrived in Laramie 3 days earlier by stagecoach from Denver, Colorado, where she had lived for the past 4 years working as a schoolteacher while sending money home to her father. She was 28 years old. She had never married, not because she lacked opportunity, but because every man who had courted her had eventually arrived at the same conclusion, that they wanted a wife who would agree with them. And Jane Baker agreed with very few things and nobody in particular when the facts said otherwise. Her father Thomas had come west from Ohio in 1873 with her mother Margaret, who had died of fever in the winter of 1874, before she ever got to see the house Thomas built on the Laramie River land. Thomas had built it anyway. He had planted crops, strung fence, dug a well with his own 2 hands, and spent 4 years making something from nothing on 320 acres of Wyoming grass. Then his heart had started giving him trouble in the winter of 1877, and by the spring of 1878, he could not reliably rise from his bed without assistance. Jane had received the letter about the competing claim from her neighbor Ruth Alderman, who had ridden 2 hours to the nearest telegraph office to send word after she realized Thomas was too ill to handle it himself. Jane had read the telegram 3 times, packed her trunk in the space of an evening, arranged for a colleague to cover her classes, and boarded the southbound stage the following morning. She had spent the 4-day journey from Denver reading every piece of land law she could access, which included a dog-eared copy of the Homestead Act, a legal pamphlet she had borrowed from a lawyer in Denver named Mr. Farris, who owed her a professional courtesy because she had once tutored his daughter through a difficult examination, and her own considerable capacity for systematic analysis and retention of detailed information. She arrived in Laramie knowing exactly what had been done wrong, exactly what the law said about it, and exactly what she needed from the land office to correct it. What she had not anticipated was the clerk. Calvin Reed was 32 years old. He had a face that the sun had treated honestly, tanned and weathered at the corners of the eyes, with the kind of lines that come from squinting at long distances and laughing at the right things. His hair was dark brown and wanted cutting. He wore a plain white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and a leather vest that had seen considerable use. He was not the picture of frontier romance in the way that dime novels described their heroes. He was something more interesting than that. He was precise. He was careful. He listened with his whole attention, which is rarer than people think, and when he had looked at that file and said the words "I owe you an apology on behalf of this office," the words had not been reflexive or diplomatic. They had cost him something. She could tell the difference. She did not think about any of this consciously in the moment. She was entirely focused on her father's claim. Calvin walked her through what the file showed. He explained that the abandonment clause of the Homestead Act required specific criteria to be met, including documentation of the claimant's absence, a formal inspection of the property, and a waiting period. None of those steps had been completed. Hargrove's claim was procedurally invalid from the first page. The problem was that it had been signed by the supervising recorder, Gerald Whitmore, which meant reversing it would require either Whitmore's agreement, which Calvin considered unlikely given the penciled dollar sign in the margin, or a formal complaint to the General Land Office in Washington, which would take months. Jane said, "My father does not have months. If Hargrove has a signed approval, what prevents him from physically taking possession of the land while this is contested?" Calvin said, "Technically, nothing except the willingness of the local sheriff to enforce or not enforce the claim." Jane said, "Who is the local sheriff?" Calvin said, "Man named Eli Dawson. He is a reasonable person. He is also not especially inclined to move against anyone backed by paper from this office." Jane said, "Then we need better paper." Calvin looked at her. He said, "Miss Baker, what you are describing would require me to file a counter-notation on this claim, which is something I have the authority to do as a deputy recorder, but which will put me directly in conflict with my supervisor." She said, "I know. I am asking you to do it anyway." A long moment passed between them. The three men on the bench along the wall had been listening with increasing fascination and decreasing pretense of minding their own business. One of them, an older farmer with a red beard, had leaned so far forward on the bench that he was in genuine danger of sliding off it. Calvin picked up his pen. He said, "I'll need your father's original claim number and the survey description." She opened her satchel and produced a second document. That was the beginning. The counter-notation took 40 minutes to compose correctly. Jane stood on her side of the counter the entire time, answering questions when Calvin needed clarification about dates and descriptions, and watching his handwriting with the same focused attention she gave everything. His handwriting was unexpectedly fine, clear and even, the handwriting of someone who took the permanent nature of written records seriously. When it was done, he had her sign as the claimant's authorized representative, which required him to locate a specific form that took another 10 minutes to find because Whitmore had reorganized the filing system 3 months ago in a way that made no logical sense, and that Calvin had been protesting internally ever since. He said while searching through the third drawer, "Your father is on the land now," she said. "He is. My neighbor Ruth Alderman and her husband have been checking on him daily. He is stable but weak." He said, "When are you planning to go out there?" She said, "Tomorrow morning. I need to find a horse or arrange a ride. I arrived by stage." He found the form. He stood up, set it on the counter and said, "I know where to find a reliable horse for a fair price. And I am going to need to ride out to the Baker claim myself to conduct the inspection that should have been conducted before Hargrove's application was processed. If it would suit your schedule, we could ride out together tomorrow." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Are you doing that because it is procedure or because you want to make sure I actually get there without interference?" He said, "Both." She said, "That is an honest answer." He said, "I try to make a habit of it." She said, "All right then. What time?" He said, 7 in the morning. "I'll meet you in front of the Frontier Hotel if that's where you're staying." She said it was. She closed her satchel, picked it up, turned toward the door, and then turned back. She said, "Calvin Reed." She was reading his name from the small placard on the counter. "That counter-notation you just filed. Whitmore is going to know about it by tomorrow afternoon." Calvin said, "I expect so," she said. "That is going to cause you a significant problem." He said, "I expect that too," she said. "Why are you doing it?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, because it is the right thing to do, and I have been moving past right things too often lately. I am glad you came in today." She held his gaze for one moment that was slightly longer than necessary. Then she said, 7 o'clock, and walked out into the summer heat of Laramie, Wyoming, with her satchel under her arm and the slightly altered posture of someone who has just had an unexpected encounter with a person worth thinking about. The ride out to the Baker claim the following morning took just under 2 hours north of town, along a trail that followed the river before cutting east across open grassland toward a low ridge of cottonwood trees. The morning air was cool and smelled of sage and the distant rain that had moved through the mountains during the night. The sky was the particular brilliant blue that Wyoming produces in the early hours of a summer morning before the heat builds, the kind of blue that makes a person feel that the whole world is new and that whatever was heavy yesterday might be set down for a while. They rode side by side, and they talked. Jane learned that Calvin had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 children, the son of a postmaster who had raised all of them on the importance of accuracy, and the idea that a record improperly kept was not just a mistake but a form of dishonesty. She learned that he had come west in 1872 because he had thought about it for years and one morning, simply decided that thinking was not the same as doing. She learned that he had spent a year working cattle drives out of Texas before a broken collarbone had sidelined him long enough to accept a temporary position as a land office clerk in Colorado, and that the temporary position had become a career, which he had not entirely intended, but had found he was genuinely good at and mostly satisfied by. Until the past year. He did not elaborate on the "until the past year" part immediately. She noted it and moved on. Calvin learned that Jane had grown up in Cincinnati, the only daughter of Thomas Baker and the late Margaret Baker, whose memory lived in the way Jane sometimes paused before she spoke, as though checking her words against an internal standard of precision that had been set by someone she respected enormously. He learned that she had taught school for 4 years in Denver, and that she was regarded by her students with a mixture of genuine affection and slight terror, which she considered the correct balance. He learned that she had read every piece of law she could access for 4 days on a stagecoach, not because she enjoyed legal reading, though she did, but because she loved her father and she was not going to walk into a fight without ammunition. He said, "What does your father think about you coming out here to handle this?" she said. "He wrote me a letter telling me not to. He said he would manage it himself when he was feeling better." He also said in the same letter that he hadn't been able to get out of bed for 3 days, which suggests his judgment about what he could manage was somewhat optimistic. Calvin said, "Is he likely to be angry that you came?" She said, "He is going to be extremely relieved and will spend the first 10 minutes insisting he would have been fine." Calvin laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one. It came from somewhere genuine, and it changed the whole topography of his face. She looked at him when he laughed and then looked away at the trail ahead. They arrived at the Baker claim at 9 in the morning. The house was a solid structure, more substantial than many homestead buildings, built of cut timber with a covered porch and glass windows, which in 1878 on the Wyoming frontier represented a considerable investment of both money and effort. The fields to the east showed the evidence of 4 years of cultivation, plowed earth in organized rows, a kitchen garden closer to the house, a small orchard of apple trees that were young but well established. 2 horses were in the fenced paddock. A milk cow regarded them without interest from the near side of the fence. Ruth Alderman came out onto the porch before they had dismounted. She was a compact woman of about 50 with gray-streaked hair and the capable, observant manner of someone who had spent decades managing the practical details of frontier life. She looked at Jane with relief and then looked at Calvin with assessment. Jane said, "Ruth, this is Calvin Reed from the land office. He is here to conduct a proper inspection of the property." Ruth said, "About time someone from that office did their job." Then she said, "Come inside. Thomas is awake. He's going to be furious at Jane for coming and glad to see her at the same time, and both feelings are going to come out as talking too fast about the crops, so prepare yourselves. She was exactly right. Thomas Baker was a man of about 60, thin now in the way that illness thins a person down to their essential structure, but with sharp blue eyes and a quick mind that his body was failing to keep up with. He was sitting up in his bed when they came in, and the moment he saw Jane, his face went through approximately 6 emotions in 4 seconds, ending on a version of relief so profound it looked like pain. He said, "I told you not to come," and reached for her hand. She sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand and said, "I know, I came anyway." He said, "I would have handled it." She said, "I know that too." He looked past her at Calvin. He said, "You're from the land office." Calvin said, "Yes, sir. Calvin Reed, Deputy Recorder. I am here to conduct the inspection that should have been completed before the competing claim was processed. With your permission, I'd like to walk the property, measure and document the improvements, and create a formal record that accurately represents the state of this homestead." Thomas Baker looked at him for a long moment with the assessing eyes of a man who has learned that not everything wearing a government face is working in your interest. Then he said, "Jane, you trust this man?" Jane looked at Calvin. It was a genuine consideration, not a reflexive response. She said, "Yes, I do." Thomas said, "Then go do your inspection. Ruth will show you around." The inspection took 3 hours. Calvin was thorough in a way that was clearly deliberate, not just procedurally complete but exhaustively documented. He measured the house and its outbuildings. He counted and recorded the cultivated acreage. He noted the well, the paddock, the fencing, the orchard. He found the original survey stakes and confirmed the property boundaries. He wrote everything down in a precise hand in the record book he had brought from the office, and when he was done, the document he had created was an irrefutable account of an occupied, improved, actively maintained homestead claim that met and exceeded every requirement of the Homestead Act for the full 3 years that had elapsed since Thomas Baker's claim had been approved. Jane had walked with him for parts of the inspection and spent other parts sitting with her father. She had watched Calvin work. She had watched the care he took, the way he double-checked measurements, the way he stopped to ask Ruth questions about when certain improvements had been made and wrote down her answers verbatim. He was not performing thoroughness. He was genuinely thorough. It was, she found, a quality she respected profoundly and had rarely encountered. When he was done, he came back to the house and sat down at the kitchen table where Jane had made coffee. He spread the inspection document on the table. He said, "This is a complete record. I'm going to file this alongside the counter notation today when I get back to town." Together they create a clear picture of the fraudulent nature of Hargrove's claim, but I want to be direct with you about the next problem. He said that Douglas Hargrove was not a small-time opportunist. He had been researching while Jane was sitting with her father, asking Ruth careful questions. Hargrove was backed by a consortium of land speculators operating out of Cheyenne, a group that had been systematically identifying homestead claims held by vulnerable owners, primarily the elderly, the ill, and widows, and using their connections in various land offices across Wyoming Territory to push through fraudulent competing claims. Gerald Whitmore was not the only corrupt clerk they had reached. The $sign in the margin of Hargrove's file was almost certainly one of several such payments made across the territory. Jane was quiet for a moment after he said this. Then she said, "So my father's claim is one of many," Calvin said. "I believe so." "Yes," she said, "and the correct response is not just to fight this claim but to expose the entire system." He said, "If the evidence supports it, yes." The General Land Office in Washington has an Inspector General's division. A complaint filed with sufficient documentation could open an investigation that covers the whole territory. Jane looked at the inspection document on the table. She looked at Calvin. She said, "That kind of complaint needs to be filed by someone with standing, someone who can provide direct testimony about the fraudulent process." He said, "It does," she said. "You witnessed the original fraudulent filing. You found the notation in the margin. You conducted this inspection. He said, I know what you are suggesting. She said, is it something you would be willing to do? He said, filing a formal complaint against my supervisor with the Inspector General's office would end my employment. Whitmore will see to that regardless of the outcome of the investigation. I will not be working in any Wyoming Territory land office after this. She said, I know, I am still asking. He looked at her across the table and she looked back at him, and there was something happening between them in that moment that was larger than the problem on the table between them, though neither of them named it. He said, yes, I will do it, not just for your father's claim, though that matters. Because what they are doing is a systematic betrayal of every person who came west under the promise of the Homestead Act, and I have been close enough to see it and done nothing long enough. Thomas Baker, who had apparently been listening from the bedroom with the door slightly ajar, said in a carrying voice, I like this young man. Jane closed her eyes briefly. She said, Papa, Thomas said, I'm just stating a fact. Ruth, who was washing dishes at the basin, said without turning around, he is not wrong. Calvin looked at the table. There was a faint color along his jaw that had nothing to do with the sun. The trouble began faster than Calvin had anticipated. He arrived back in Laramie at mid-afternoon to find Gerald Whitmore sitting at the long oak counter in Calvin's spot, reading the counter notation Calvin had filed the previous day. Whitmore was a man of 55, broad through the shoulders, with the self-satisfied manner of someone who has been comfortable and unchallenged for long enough that he has forgotten discomfort is possible. He looked up when Calvin came through the door. He said, Sit down, read. Calvin sat on the wrong side of the counter, on the bench where the claimant sat, and realized that the symbolism of that arrangement was probably intentional. Whitmore said, I see you filed a counter notation on the Hargrove claim. Calvin said, I did. The original filing was procedurally invalid. Whitmore said, I approve that claim. Calvin said, I know. With respect, sir, the approval did not correct the procedural failures. The inspection wasn't conducted, the notification period wasn't observed, and the abandonment documentation was insufficient under the Act. Whitmore set down the counter notation. He said, Read, I have been running this office for 7 years. I have approved over 400 claims. I know what the procedure requires. Calvin said, Then you know the Hargrove claim didn't meet it. The silence that followed was the particular kind that contains a hidden threat. The silence of a man deciding whether to show his hand or keep it concealed a little longer. Whitmore chose concealment. He said, I'm going to need you to withdraw that counter notation. Calvin said, I won't be doing that. Whitmore said, Then you're going to find your position here considerably more difficult. Calvin said, I expect so. He stood up. He said, I also conducted an on-site inspection of the Baker homestead today, which I have documented and will be filing this afternoon. The property shows full and continuous improvement in occupation. The claim of abandonment is factually unsupported. He walked around the counter, gently moved Whitmore out of his chair by the simple act of standing beside it until social gravity took effect, sat down, and began preparing the inspection document for filing. Whitmore stood in the middle of the office for a moment, recalculating. Then he walked out without another word, which was, Calvin thought, the more alarming response of the available options. A man who argues is still engaging. A man who goes silent and leaves is making a different kind of plan. He filed the inspection document. He also, that evening, sitting at the small desk in his rented room above the Laramie hardware store, began composing the formal complaint to the General Land Office Inspector General's Division. He had 3 specific pieces of evidence: the counter notation he had filed, the inspection document, and the original Hargrove file with Whitmore's penciled notation in the margin, which he had carefully removed from the filing cabinet and placed in his coat pocket before leaving the office, because he had known the moment he saw Whitmore sitting at his counter that the original document's continued existence in that filing cabinet was not something he could count on. The complaint took 4 hours to write. He wrote it with the same precision he brought to his official records, factual, specific, documented, citing the relevant regulations at each point. When he was done, he read it twice, made 3 small corrections, sealed it in an envelope addressed to the Inspector General's office, General Land Office, Washington, District of Columbia, and set it on the corner of the desk to mail in the morning. He sat for a while after that in the quiet of the room, listening to the sounds of Laramie at night, the distant piano from the hotel saloon, horses in the street, the occasional voice. He thought about what he had just done. He thought about Thomas Baker lying in his bed in a house he had built with his own hands. He thought about Jane Baker standing on her side of the counter that afternoon the previous day, citing federal land regulations with the precise calm of someone who has decided to use the truth as a weapon because it is the most effective weapon available. He thought about the way she had said, "Yes, I do," when her father asked if she trusted him. He went asleep thinking about that. Jane spent 2 nights at the Baker homestead to make sure her father was stable and to sit with him through the evenings and talk. Thomas Baker was a man who had spent 4 years in relative solitude, sustained by the work and by the occasional company of neighbors, but fundamentally alone since Margaret died, and the presence of his daughter was a restorative that no medicine could have provided. She read to him in the evenings from the books she had brought in her satchel. She made the meals Ruth had been making, and made them better by virtue of having had 4 years in Denver to learn some additional techniques from a landlady who had been a cook in a St. Louis hotel. She assessed his condition carefully and concluded that with rest and proper food and the absence of the grinding anxiety about the land claim, he had a reasonable prospect of significant improvement. She also thought about Calvin Reed, which she did with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything, which meant she did it properly and thoroughly rather than dismissing it as sentimental. She was 28 years old. She had not been in love before, not precisely, not in the way that the books described it. She had been interested in men on several occasions. She had been kissed twice, once in Cincinnati at 17 by a boy named Michael who had immediately become so nervous afterward that he could not speak coherently for a week, and once in Denver at 24 by a man named Francis who had been a colleague at the school and who had then, upon her declining his subsequent proposal, informed her that she was too opinionated for any sensible man to want her. She had found this assessment both irritating and probably true in his specific case, and had moved on. What she recognized in Calvin Reed was different from what she had felt in either of those encounters, and different from what she had expected to find anywhere in Wyoming Territory. He was honest in a way that cost him something. He was careful without being timid. He had looked at an evidently corrupt situation in his own workplace and chosen to do the right thing not because it was easy or safe, but because it was right, and he had done it without requiring her to beg or persuade or argue past his reluctance. He had picked up the pen and done it. She respected that so thoroughly that it felt like something else, something that started in her chest and spread outward into her hands and the top of her head when she thought about his face when he laughed. She returned to Laramie on the 3rd day. She had told her father she would come back in a week to check on him, and she had arranged with Ruth to continue her daily visits and to send word immediately if there was any change. She also had several more things to do in Laramie before she could consider returning to Denver, assuming she was going to return to Denver, which she was beginning to think about in a more complicated way than she had before. She arrived at the land office at 10 in the morning. There was a man she had not seen before sitting at the counter, a young man of perhaps 20, with a nervous expression and the look of someone sitting in a chair that doesn't quite fit him. Calvin was not there. She asked the young man, whose name turned out to be Martin, where Calvin Reed was. Martin said with visible discomfort, "Mr. Reed has been placed on suspension pending a review of recent filings." Jane was very still for a moment. She said, "By whom?" Martin said, "Supervisor Whitmore." She said, "When?" He said, "Yesterday morning." She said, "Where is Calvin Reed now?" Martin said, I believe he is at his rooms, ma'am. He hesitated, then said quietly, leaning forward slightly, "The suspension was posted before he came in. He left without an argument, but he also left with his personal files." Martin looked at her with the expression of someone conveying information through careful implication. "I thought you should know that," she said. "Thank you, Martin." She went directly to the hardware store. The proprietor confirmed that the man renting the room above was in. She went up the exterior stairs and knocked. Calvin opened the door. He was in his shirt sleeves, and the small table in the room was covered in papers. He looked unsurprised to see her, which meant he had been expecting her, which meant he had understood that she would find out and come. She came in without being invited and looked at the papers on the table. She recognized the Hargrove file. She recognized the inspection document he had filed. She saw the draft of something longer and more complex that she understood immediately to be the complaint to Washington. She said, "Whitmore suspended you," he said, "yesterday morning. I have been placed on administrative suspension pending review of my counter-notation, which Whitmore is characterizing as an unauthorized and procedurally irregular action." She said, "Is that what he put in writing?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then he has put in writing that he considers the counter-notation unauthorized, which means he is asserting his own authority over the approval of the Hargrove claim, which means we have in his own words his acknowledgement that he was the one who approved it." Calvin looked at her. A slow expression crossed his face, the expression of someone watching an unexpected solution assemble itself. He said, "That's correct." She said, "So his attempt to protect himself has given us additional documentation." He said, "Jane." It was the first time he had used her given name. He caught himself. He said, "Miss Baker, I need to be honest with you about the situation. I mailed the complaint to Washington this morning. That process will take weeks at minimum and months more likely. In the meantime, Hargrove still has a signed approval from Whitmore. He has not moved on the property yet, but his legal ability to do so is intact, and I am now without employment, which limits my practical capacity to assist you." She said, "I understand all of that. Can I sit down?" He moved a stack of papers from the only chair and she sat down. He sat on the edge of the bed, which was the only other option in the small room, and the proximity was slightly closer than either of them was used to in a strictly professional context, which both of them noticed and neither of them addressed. She said, "I have been thinking about the fastest path to a resolution that actually protects my father's land before Hargrove acts on his claim. The Washington complaint is the correct long-term answer, but you're right that it is slow." "What are the options that work faster?" he said. "The Federal Circuit Court. A judge can issue an injunction stopping Hargrove from taking possession while the claim is contested, but that requires a lawyer. I know one in Denver who owes me a professional courtesy." He said, "Mr. Ferris." She looked at him. He said, "You mentioned him on the ride out." She said, "Yes, Edgar Ferris. He practices land law among other things. If I explain the situation and provide him the documentation, he may be willing to file for an injunction on favorable terms given that the documentation is strong." Calvin said, "The circuit court judge for this district is Harold Crane. He sits in Cheyenne. He is known to be reasonably impartial, which in Wyoming Territory in 1878 is about as good as you can hope for." She said, "Then I need to get a telegram to Ferris today. And you need to help me write it, because he will take it more seriously if it cites the specific procedural failures from someone who witnessed them." He said, "That I can do." They spent the next 2 hours at the small table composing the telegram to Edgar Ferris. Calvin drafted the legal description, and Jane refined the language, and between them they produced something that was both precise and urgent, which is a difficult combination to achieve in the 100-word limit of a telegram. Jane went to the telegraph office and sent it at 3 in the afternoon. The response came back from Denver the following morning. Ferris would take the case. He asked for the full documentation to be sent by express mail immediately, and he would file for the injunction within the week. He also said that the situation Jane described sounded like something he had seen elements of before, in Colorado and now apparently in Wyoming, and that he had a colleague in Cheyenne who might be very interested in what Calvin's complaint to Washington might eventually uncover. Jane read the reply telegram on the steps of the telegraph office and felt, for the first time since the moment she had read Ruth's wire in Denver, that the weight she had been carrying had become something she could actually set down. Not all of it, not permanently, but enough. She went directly to Calvin's rented room and knocked. He opened the door. She held up the telegram. He read it. His face went through relief and then something else, something more complex. He said, "This is good news." She said, "It is. Ferris will file the injunction. It will probably hold. My father's land will be protected while the complaint works through the system." He said, "Yes," she said, "which means the immediate crisis is manageable." He said, "It does." She said, "Which means I have a decision to make about returning to Denver." He said, "I see," she said. "My position at the school is being held for me. I arranged a month's absence, but no longer. I need to make a decision." He said, "Miss Baker, Jane." He stopped. He said, "I don't know how to ask what I want to ask without it being inappropriate given the amount of time we have known each other and the circumstances under which we met." She said, "Ask it anyway." He said, "Is there anything in Laramie that might be worth staying for? Beyond your father's situation, I mean. I understand if the answer is no. I understand that what I am about to say is probably premature and possibly strange. But I have been sitting in this room for 2 days thinking about things that have nothing to do with the Hargrove claim, and I would rather be honest about them than pretend I am only thinking about the legal situation." She looked at him for a moment in the quiet of the room. She said, "What are you thinking about?" He said, "The way you cited Section 14 of the 1862 regulations at me across that counter. The way you said yes when your father asked if you trusted me. The way you looked at the apple trees on your father's property like you were seeing the person who planted them." She said, "That is a very specific list." He said, "I told you I am a clerk. I notice details." She said, "Calvin." It was the first time she had used his given name without the title. He was quiet. She said, "I am not a woman who does things by half measures. If I stayed in Laramie, I would not be staying tentatively. I would be staying with intention, and I would expect the same in return." He said, "You would have it." She said, "I need some time to think, not a great deal of time. I am not slow about decisions, but some." He said, "Take all the time you need." She said, "I also need to go back to see my father next week regardless of what I decide, and I would like you to come with me if you are willing, not for the land claim but because I think he enjoyed talking to you." Calvin said, "He barely spoke to me." She said, "That is his way. He asks you back, that means he likes you." Calvin said, "Then yes, I will come." The injunction was filed within the week as Ferris had promised. Judge Crane signed it 9 days later. The order arrived in Laramie by federal mail on a Tuesday, and Calvin, who was still technically suspended but had not been formally dismissed because Whitmore was apparently uncertain how to proceed given that Calvin's actions were now part of a documented record that could be used against him, read the order in his rented room, and then walked to the Frontier Hotel and slid it under the door of Jane's room because it was 6 in the morning, and he thought she was probably still asleep. She was not asleep. She had been awake for an hour reading the copy of the homestead regulations. She had not yet returned to Edgar Ferris's legal pamphlet because it interested her. She opened the door when she heard the sound of something sliding under it, picked up the injunction order, read it, and opened the door. He was still in the corridor. She said, "It's signed." He said, "Yes." She held the document in both hands. She said, "My father's land is protected." He said, "For now. Until the investigation and the contested claim are fully resolved. But yes, he cannot be removed." She looked at him in the early light coming through the corridor window at the end of the hall, and she said, "Thank you. I know what you gave up to make this possible." He said, "I gave up a job that I had already decided to leave because the reasons for staying had grown very thin." She said, "What will you do?" He said, "I have been thinking about that. I have been thinking about it quite a lot." He paused. "There is a property. about 40 miles north and east of here. 160 acres on good grassland with water access. The owner passed away last spring and the claim has reverted to the public domain. I have thought about filing a homestead claim on it, she said. You have thought about farming, he said. I have thought about building something, which is different from farming but related to it. He looked at the window at the end of the corridor. I have been sitting behind a counter for 6 years watching other people file claims on land they are going to build their lives on. I think I have been jealous of them for longer than I have admitted, she said. 160 acres is a considerable undertaking for one person. He said, very carefully, yes, it is. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was gentle and the corridor was quiet, and there were approximately 14 things being said in the space between them without words, all of them true. She said, I made my decision. He said, did you? She said, I am going to write to the school board today and resign my position. I am going to do it by the last week of August to give them sufficient time to find a replacement before the September term. He was very still. He said, and after August, she said, after August I will be in Wyoming. My father needs someone nearby. And I have found that I have a considerable interest in matters of land law and frontier legal process that I might do something useful with, given the right circumstances. He said, Jane. She said, yes. He said, I am going to ask you something that is considerably more forward than anything I have said yet. And I want you to understand that I am asking because I mean it completely, and not because the situation suggests it or because I think it is expected. I have known you for 2 weeks. I understand that is not long. But I am 32 years old and I have not in 32 years met a person who made me want to completely rearrange my plans for the future within 2 weeks of meeting them. She said, that is quite a preface. He said, I know, I am a clerk. I document everything thoroughly. She said, ask your question, Calvin. He said, will you let me court you properly? With the full understanding that I am doing so with serious intention, and not as a way to pass the time before you return to Denver or as anything other than exactly what it is, which is me telling you that I would very much like to spend the next several decades in your company if you will permit me to try to earn that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that was the most formal and thorough declaration I have ever received. He said, was it too much? She said, no. It was exactly right. She held out her hand. He took it. They shook hands with the gravity of people sealing a genuine agreement, and then both of them realized that they were holding hands in a hotel corridor at 6 in the morning and laughed at the same time, and then neither of them let go for another moment. The weeks that followed were the best of Calvin Reed's adult life by a considerable distance. He had spent enough years being competent and organized, and essentially alone, that he had arrived at a private conviction that something was missing, but had forgotten that missing things could be found. He had forgotten that days could contain things other than the satisfactory completion of tasks. He courted Jane Baker with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, which in practice meant he paid attention. He learned what she liked and what she didn't. He learned that she liked coffee strong and her mornings quiet, and that she read with genuine veracity across subjects she found interesting and complete indifference to subjects she didn't. He learned that she found arithmetic restful, which he found wonderfully peculiar. He learned that she had her mother's habit of pausing before she spoke and her father's habit of saying exactly what she meant when she got there, and that the combination of those two tendencies produced a kind of speech that was rare in its accuracy. He took her to see the land 40 miles north and east. They rode out on a bright morning in mid-August when the grass was at its late summer gold and the sky was big and still. He showed her the creek that cut through the eastern third of the property, the natural tree break on the north side that would shelter a house from winter wind, the slight rise near the center of the acreage that offered a view in 4 directions, and where he had been mentally placing a house for the past week. She stood on the rise and looked out in 4 directions. She said, the soil near the creek would support a kitchen garden, "The slope to the south gets good sun." He said, "Yes." She said, "You would need to get the house up before winter." He said, "I know." She said, "That is about 10 weeks." He said, "Yes." She said, "Calvin, are you going to ask me to marry you standing on a hill in August? Because if you are going to ask me, you should know that I am going to say yes, but that I also think we should tell my father in person before you ask officially, which means you will need to wait until the weekend when we ride out to see him." He stared at her. He said, "You have already decided." She said, "I decided approximately 10 days ago. I was waiting for you to catch up." He said, "I have been trying to find the right moment." She said, "You were overthinking it. You do that sometimes." He said, "I am aware. It is a flaw." She said, "It is not a flaw. It is the same quality that makes you write thorough inspection reports. I am not criticizing it. I am just letting you know you have more latitude than you think." He said, "Jane Baker." She said, "Yes." He said, "I would very much like to ask your father for your hand this weekend." She said, "Then we have a plan." They rode back to Laramie with the late afternoon sun on their backs, and somewhere between the rise with its view in 4 directions and the edge of town, their horses fell into an easy walk side by side, and his hand found hers across the space between them, and she did not let go until they reached the first street. Thomas Baker did not react to Calvin's request the way Calvin had anticipated. He had anticipated a thorough interrogation regarding prospects, intentions, and capacity to provide for his daughter. Instead, Thomas looked at him for a long moment, looked at Jane, and said, "She already said yes, didn't she?" Jane said, "Papa." Thomas said, "I can see it on both of you. You have both already decided." He sounded profoundly pleased about this. He said to Calvin, "She came into this world arguing with me about everything, and I have spent 28 years being grateful for it every single day." "You understand what you are getting," Calvin said. "I believe so, sir." Thomas said, "You don't yet, but you will, and you are going to be very happy about it." He held out his hand. Calvin shook it. Thomas said, "When?" Jane said, "October, if you're feeling strong enough to come to town for it." Thomas said, "I will be feeling strong enough to come to town for it if I have to be carried, which I won't, because I intend to be well enough to walk on my own 2 feet to see my daughter married." He was. Whatever combination of reduced anxiety, improved food, regular rest, and the knowledge that his land was secure had worked on Thomas Baker through the weeks of August and September. He arrived in Laramie in the first week of October walking with a cane, but under his own power, and he sat in the front pew of the small Presbyterian church near the center of town with Ruth Alderman on his left and her husband George on his right. And he watched his daughter marry Calvin Reed on a clear October morning, with the aspens turning gold outside the windows. Jane wore a cream-colored wool dress she had ordered by mail from a dressmaker in Denver, a woman she had known during her time there, and who had done the work on short notice with considerable skill. She carried a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers that Calvin had ridden out at dawn to collect from the field near the property they were about to build a life on, which he presented to her outside the church, and which was the detail that, of all the details of the morning, she found most affecting. The minister's name was Reverend Howard. He performed the ceremony with the appropriate solemnity and a few words of genuine warmth that suggested he had heard something of the story of the land claim and thought well of what both of them had done about it. Calvin's ring for Jane was a simple gold band, plain and well-made, which suited her exactly. She had found a ring for him in a jewelry shop in Laramie, a wider band in gold with a small decorative edge, and when she put it on his finger, she did it with the gravity of a person completing an important record correctly, which made him love her more, if that was possible. The Washington investigation did not move quickly, but it moved, and it moved with the relentless momentum of an official process fed by thorough documentation from a credible source. Edgar Ferris's colleague in Cheyenne, a federal attorney named Marshall Hayden, had made contact with the Inspector General's office in September, and had begun coordinating the Wyoming evidence with cases from Colorado and Nebraska that bore the same fingerprints. Gerald Whitmore was summoned to Cheyenne for questioning in November. Douglas Hargrove's claim was formally invalidated in December. The consortium of land speculators from Cheyenne was named in a federal inquiry that would conclude the following year. Calvin received a letter from Inspector General's office in late November acknowledging his complaint and his cooperation, and noting that his documentation had been instrumental in establishing the pattern of fraudulent activity. The letter was formal and careful in the way that official correspondence must be, but between its lines, there was something that read very much like genuine gratitude. He read it to Jane that evening. They were sitting by the stove in the one-room structure they had built on the rise on their property, the first room of the house they intended to eventually make larger, but already fitted out with enough comfort and warmth and careful attention to be genuinely a home. She was mending a shirt. He was sitting across from her. When he finished reading the letter, she looked up and said, "You did a good thing." He said, "We did," she said. "You did most of it. I arrived angry with good arguments. You chose to act on them." He said, "You would have found another way without me." She said, "Probably, but it would have been slower and harder and considerably less pleasant." She set down the mending. "I am glad you were behind that counter," he said. "I was not glad before you walked through the door. I had not been glad in that office for about a year. I was staying out of inertia and the absence of a better idea," she said. "And then a woman walked in and argued land law at you." He said, "And then a woman walked in and argued land law at me, and I fell in love with her on the spot, which was deeply inconvenient for several days before it became the best thing that had ever happened to me." She looked at him across the stove's warmth. She said, "You fell in love with me on the spot," he said, "on the spot." Approximately 45 seconds into the conversation, which I recognize was fast, she said, "It was not that fast for me. It took at least 4 days. He said, 4 days, she said. "I was preoccupied with the legal situation." He said, "Reasonably," she said, "and I was not entirely sure I was reading you correctly. I have occasionally misread people before." He said, "Have you?" "Frequently," she said, "once, in Denver. It resulted in a man telling me I was too opinionated for any sensible man to want me." Calvin said, "He was a fool," she said. "He was. I came to that conclusion quickly. I was more careful after that." He said, "I am glad you were careful long enough to come to the correct conclusion." She said, "Which is," he said, "that an opinionated woman who knows the Homestead Act, argues with land office clerks, rides 40 miles to protect her father, and cites Section 14 from memory is not too much for a sensible man. She is exactly right for the correct one." She came around the stove to where he was sitting and sat beside him on the bench, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they sat there in the warm room with the Wyoming night outside, listening to the wind move across the grassland, both of them thinking privately that the word home had grown to contain more than it used to. The winter of 1878 going into 1879 was cold in the way that Wyoming winters are genuinely cold, which is to say the kind of cold that is not a hardship but a serious and demanding fact of life that requires preparation and respect. They had prepared. The house, small as it was well insulated and well stocked, and Calvin proved himself as capable with practical construction as he had been with bureaucratic documentation, which Jane found deeply satisfying. She had, in the month since her resignation from the Denver school, been thinking about what she wanted to do with her particular combination of skills on the Wyoming frontier. She had the knowledge. She had the interest. She had observed, in the experience of her father's case, and in the conversations she had with Calvin about the broader pattern of land fraud in the territory, that there were a great many homesteaders, particularly those who were not native English speakers, who were not literate, who were isolated from legal resources, or who simply did not know what their rights were under the Homestead Act, who were vulnerable to exactly the kind of predatory scheme that had targeted her father. She began, in the early months of 1879, writing a plain language guide to homestead rights and procedures under the Homestead Act, with specific reference to Wyoming Territory regulations. It was not a legal document. It was a practical document, written in language that a farmer or a rancher or a recent immigrant could read and understand, covering what the act guaranteed, what the procedures required, what to do if a competing claim appeared, and where to seek help. She spent the winter evenings working on it by lamplight while Calvin read, or repaired tools, or occasionally looked up from what he was doing and watched her write with the particular expression of someone who finds what they are looking at quietly wonderful. She finished it in March of 1879. She sent it to Edgar Farris in Denver, who had it printed at a Denver press at his own expense, because he said it was the single most practical legal document he had seen produced for common people in his 15 years of practice, and that he intended to distribute it across the territory. He also asked if she would be willing to write a complimentary document about the legal resources available to settlers, and she said yes. Thomas Baker came to stay with them for a month in the spring, making the trip from the homestead by wagon with George Alderman driving, and spent the month sitting on the porch of their house in the mornings drinking coffee and watching the grassland and looking healthier than he had looked in 2 years. He took a great interest in the progress Calvin was making on extending the house, asked extensive questions about the construction methods, and offered opinions with the authority of a man who had built his own house and therefore had relevant expertise. One evening in April, sitting at the table after supper, Thomas said to Calvin, "You plan to stay on this land, long term?" Calvin said, "Yes, sir, that is my intention." Thomas said, "You're going to need more than 160 acres eventually if you're going to do it right." Calvin said, "I know. There is adjacent land to the north that is still available. I have been thinking about filing a second claim." Thomas said, "That's smart. Do it before someone else does." He paused. "I built my place alone, worked harder than I should have, stayed isolated too long. You've got her." He nodded at Jane, who was washing the supper dishes. "That's worth more than the land." Calvin said, "I know it." Thomas said, "Good, as long as you know it." Jane, without turning from the basin, said, "I can hear everything you are saying." Thomas said, "I know. I am saying it for both of you." He looked pleased with himself. He picked up his coffee cup. The federal investigation concluded in the autumn of 1879 with a formal finding of fraud against Douglas Hargrove and several associated parties. Gerald Whitmore was removed from his position and barred from federal employment. 2 other land office supervisors in Wyoming Territory were similarly removed. Hargrove was fined substantially, and the fraudulent claims he had been involved in were voided. Thomas Baker's original claim was formally confirmed in all respects, and the certification document arrived at the Baker homestead in November 1879, with no notation in any margin except the official stamp. Calvin received a letter from the Inspector General's office in that same month, acknowledging the completion of the investigation and noting that his testimony and documentation had been essential to its success. The letter also contained a somewhat unexpected section noting that there was currently a supervisory opening in the General Land Office's Wyoming Territory Administration that required someone with extensive field experience, knowledge of the Act's procedural requirements, and demonstrated integrity. The letter asked if he would be interested in being considered for the position. He brought the letter to Jane that evening. She read it sitting at the kitchen table. She read it twice. She set it down and looked at the table for a moment and then looked at him. She said, "It would mean travel to Cheyenne regularly." He said, "Yes," she said, "but you would be the supervisor, which means you would be the one establishing how the office functions." He said, "Yes, with the authority to ensure it functions correctly," she said, "which is exactly the position we needed to exist and be filled by someone trustworthy during the entire period that Whitmore was in it." He said, "Yes," she said, "you should accept." He said, "It will mean periods away from here." She said, "I know, and it matters to me that you are here, but what you could do in that position matters more." She paused. "Also, if I am going to keep writing practical legal guides for settlers across the territory, it would be useful to have someone in the supervisory office who can actually answer their questions when they write in." He said, "Is that a professional consideration?" She said, "It is both a professional and a personal consideration, and I see no reason to separate the two." She reached across the table and put her hand on top of his. She said, "Accept it, Calvin. You earned it." He wrote his acceptance letter the following morning. The spring of 1880 arrived early in Wyoming, the kind of spring that is a surprise after the long winter, warm and green, and full of the particular optimism that the season carries in landscapes that have earned it. The house on the rise had grown through the winter with Calvin's steady work. A second room had been added, then a covered porch, and plans were laid for a third room that would be necessary, because Jane had, in February of that year, told Calvin that they were going to need it. He had received this information sitting across the breakfast table from her on a cold morning in February, and his face had gone through a sequence of expressions that she found she would remember for the rest of her life, each one slightly further into an emotion she had never seen him wear before, until he arrived at something that had no adequate name except perhaps joy, the kind that is so genuine and so large it makes a person look briefly young. He said, "In the fall." She said, "Late summer, I think, August or September." He said, "Are you well?" She said, "I am very well, slightly tired in the mornings, otherwise entirely well." He said, "Jane." He had nothing to add to that, apparently. He just said her name. She said, "I know." He came around the table and took both her hands and then, entirely out of character for a man who was generally reserved in his expressions of affection, he kissed her forehead and then her hands, and stood there holding them, and she let him, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed saying. Thomas Baker received the news with a depth of emotion he handled by walking to the far side of the room, looking out the window for a long moment, and then returning to say in a completely steady voice that he was very pleased and that he intended to be strong enough to be useful by August. He was. His health had continued to improve through the winter and spring, improved enough that by summer he was spending hours in his fields again, moving slowly but moving, with George Alderman working the harder tasks alongside him, in an arrangement that had become a comfortable partnership of neighbors and almost family. The baby arrived in late August, a boy, which Calvin received with a particular quiet pride that suited him, arriving early in the morning after a night that Jane had managed with impressive composure, and a great deal of muttered commentary about the unacceptable nature of the experience which Calvin had found simultaneously alarming and entirely characteristic of her. Ruth Alderman was there for the birth, efficient and experienced and calm, and when it was done and Jane was resting with the infant in the circle of Calvin's arm, the room was warm and the light was the early gold of a Wyoming August morning, and all three of them were briefly, quietly, absolutely fine. They named him Thomas for her father and James for Calvin's, Thomas James Reed, who entered the world opinionated about his preferences and direct about communicating them, which Calvin said was clearly his mother's doing, and Jane said was purely coincidental. Thomas Baker arrived 2 days later and held his grandson for a long time without speaking, which was the most eloquent thing Jane had ever seen her father do. The house on the rise continued to grow through 1880 and 1881, room by added room, as Calvin's new supervisory role brought in a more reliable income, and as the homestead itself, now extended by the adjacent claim to the north that Calvin had filed and was actively improving, began to produce enough to be genuinely self-sustaining. Calvin traveled to Cheyenne monthly in his official capacity, and brought the same thoroughness to the supervisory role that he had brought to the clerk's position, with the significant difference that he now, had the authority to establish the procedures and ensure they were followed, and he used that authority systematically and without apology. Jane's practical guides to settler rights had been distributed across Wyoming Territory into Colorado, and by 1880, one were being reprinted and used in Nebraska and Kansas. Edgar Ferris wrote to her that year to ask if she would consider contributing a regular column to a Denver legal publication aimed at common readers, and she said yes, and wrote the first column in November of 1881 by lamplight while Thomas James, now 14 months old and thoroughly mobile, conducted a parallel investigation of the lower shelf of the bookcase. She also began, in that same year, making herself available to homesteaders in the region who had legal questions or disputes, not as a lawyer but as an informed and determined advocate who knew exactly which questions to ask, which documents to demand, and which federal offices to contact when the answers were unsatisfactory. Several people who had been on the wrong end of various frontier injustices found, to their considerable relief, and occasionally their complete astonishment, that Jane Baker Reed was the most useful person they had ever encountered in a practical legal situation. Calvin came home from Cheyenne one evening in the fall of 1881 to find his wife at the kitchen table across from a rancher from 30 miles north, who had ridden all day to reach her, laying out a situation involving a water rights dispute that had 3 different interested parties and a corrupt county recorder. Calvin put his bag down, poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, and sat down at the end of the table to listen, because after 3 years of marriage, he understood that this was simply what evenings were sometimes, and he found that he did not mind it in the slightest. The rancher looked at him slightly uncertainly. Calvin said, "I know a great deal about recorders' offices. Between the two of us, we should be able to get this untangled. Tell us everything from the beginning." Thomas Baker came for Christmas of 1881 and stayed 2 weeks. He looked well, genuinely well, better than he had looked in years, with color in his face and a solidity to his frame that the illness had taken and that recovery had returned. He played with Thomas James with the absorbed devotion of a grandfather who has waited a long time for a grandchild, teaching him the names of things in the yard, pointing at the horses and the cold winter sky with the same patient repetition that Jane recognized as the method her father had used to teach her everything she knew when she was small. On the last evening before Thomas Baker returned to his homestead, he and Calvin sat on the porch in the cold, both of them in their coats, with the winter stars enormous and brilliant overhead. Jane could hear them through the kitchen window where she was washing the supper things. Thomas said, "You know what you have," Calvin said, "every day." Thomas said she could have gone anywhere, done anything, she chose this. Calvin said she chose well. "So did I," Thomas said. "That's the right answer." He was quiet for a moment. "Margaret would have liked you. She had a nose for people who mean what they say." Calvin said, "I would have been glad to know her." Thomas said, "You know her. She is in Jane. Everything I loved about Margaret lives in that woman." He paused. "You take care of each other." Calvin said, "We do." Thomas said, "Good." He looked at the stars. "That's enough for an old man to know." Jane set down the dish she was washing and stood for a moment with her hands in the water, looking out the window at the dark sky. She thought about what she would say if she tried to describe the life she was living to the person she had been 4 years ago, a school teacher in Denver, alone, sending money home and reading land law on a stagecoach out of love for her father and pure refusal to accept a situation she knew was wrong. She did not think she could have described it. It was too full. It was too real. It contained too many specific and irreplaceable things. The particular quality of Calvin's attention when he looked at her, her son's laugh, her father's voice from the porch, the way the grassland looked in the early morning from the rise where they had built their house. She finished the dishes and dried her hands and went out onto the porch to stand between the two of them, and they made room for her without discussion, her father on her left and her husband on her right, all three of them looking up at the enormous Wyoming sky. In the spring of 1882, when Thomas James was nearly 2 years old and speaking in complete, if occasionally inventive sentences, Jane told Calvin she thought the third bedroom was going to need to be finished before September. He looked at her across the breakfast table. He said, "September," she said, "or possibly early October. I am slightly less certain of the timing this time." He said, "How long have you known?" She said, "About 3 weeks. I wanted to be sure." He said, "Jane," she said, "I know." He came around the table. This time he did not go through a sequence of expressions. He went directly to joy, which she noted was faster than the first time, which she filed under evidence of growth as a person. Thomas James, sitting in his chair with a piece of bread, said, "Papa crying?" Calvin said, "No." He wiped his eye. "Absolutely not." Thomas James considered this and then held out the bread. The second child arrived in September, another boy, which Calvin received with the same quiet pride and Jane received with the exhausted satisfaction of someone who has completed a significant undertaking correctly. They named him Daniel George Reed, the George for George Alderman, who had spent years being quietly essential to their family without once asking for acknowledgement, and who, upon learning his name had been given to the baby, said only that it was unnecessary but very nice. Thomas Baker held Daniel George for a long time on his second visit, and looked between him and Thomas James, who was conducting an investigation of his grandfather's coat pockets with characteristic thoroughness, and said that he was a wealthy man. The winter of 1882 was cold but not brutal, and the house on the rise was by then large enough and well enough built to handle it without effort. Calvin was at his desk one evening in December, working on the annual report for the General Land Office that his supervisory role required, when Jane came and sat beside him at the desk with Daniel asleep in her arms and Thomas James already in his bed. She said, "How is the report?" He said, "Comprehensive," which is the correct answer to how a report should be, and also sometimes exhausting. He set down his pen and looked at her. "Daniel is asleep," she said. "He has been for about 20 minutes. I have been sitting with him because he is warm and the chair is comfortable." He said, "A reasonable choice." She said, "Calvin, are you content?" It was a question she asked him occasionally, directly, because she believed in the value of checking on things that mattered rather than assuming they were fine. He found this one of the many things about her that he loved without reservation. He said, "More than I have words for. Are you?" She said, "More than I expected to be," which is saying something because I have always had reasonably high expectations of what a life could be. He said, "What shifted your expectations?" She said, "A man who picked up his pen when I asked him to and did the right thing without making me beg for it. That was not what I expected to find behind a land office counter." He said, "I was not expecting you either." She said, "I know, I am hard to anticipate." He said, "You are impossible to anticipate. It is one of the best things about you." He reached over and pushed a strand of hair back from her face with one careful finger. "Every morning I get up and I do not know what you are going to think or say or decide to do, and I find that I look forward to it with complete enthusiasm." She said, "That is either a very romantic sentiment or a description of mild chaos." He said, "In my experience it is both at once." She laughed quietly so as not to wake Daniel and leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, and he rested his cheek against her hair, and the lamp was warm on the desk between the papers, and outside the Wyoming winter was doing what it always did, thorough and indifferent. But inside the house on the rise, everything was as it should be, and everything that had been broken was mended, and everyone who had been threatened was safe. And the two people who had found each other across a land office counter in the summer of 1878 sat together in the quiet, and let the evening be exactly what it was. By the spring of 1883, the Baker Reed story had become something of a well-known account in Wyoming Territory legal circles, not as a story of romance, though it was that, but as a practical example of how the fraudulent land scheme had been broken open, and what had made that possible. Calvin had given testimony twice in subsequent proceedings related to the original investigation. Jane's guides to settler rights had become standard documents distributed by several county offices across the territory, and she had added 3 more to the original by then, covering water rights, mining claim procedures, and the rights of widows under property law. Edgar Farris wrote to her in March of 1883 that a territorial bar association had been established in Wyoming, and that there was serious discussion about whether women could be admitted to practice law in the territory, a conversation that had been happening in various forms for years, and that was beginning to gain actual traction. He said her name had been mentioned in the discussion by several of the founding members, which he thought she should know. She read the letter twice. She read it to Calvin that evening. He listened carefully. He said, "What do you think?" she said. "I think it is interesting that my name is being mentioned." He said, "And?" She said, "And I think that if the opportunity becomes real, I would be a fool not to pursue it." He said, "Then pursue it," she said. "It would require formal study, some of which I have done in a practical sense but not in a credentialed way." He said, "You have been doing formal study for 5 years. You have been practicing it without the title for nearly as long. The credential would be catching up to the fact." She said, "You make it sound simple." He said, "Not simple, right?" He looked at her. "Jane, you walked into a land office and cited Section 14 at a clerk who had been processing those documents for years. You wrote guides to property law that are being distributed by county offices. If Wyoming Territory is going to admit women to the bar, I cannot think of a person more suited to be one of the first," she said. "That is possibly the most persuasive argument you have ever made to me." He said, "I have had 5 years of practice." She smiled. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box she kept correspondence in, the box that also contained, near the bottom, the original counter-notation Calvin had filed on her father's claim, which she had asked him for after the investigation concluded, and which she had kept because she believed in the importance of primary documents. Thomas Baker lived to see his grandsons learn to walk and talk and begin to learn to read. He lived to see Jane's name appear in the Wyoming press in connection with the Bar Association discussion, which he read about in a newspaper George Alderman brought him from town, and which he took to bed with him that night to read again by candlelight. He lived to see Calvin promoted to a senior advisory role in the General Land Office's territorial administration, a position that required travel, but that Calvin managed without allowing it to erode the fundamental architecture of the life they had built on the rise. Thomas passed away in the winter of 1884, quietly and without distress, in his own bed in the house he had built, on the land that bore his registered claim, surrounded by the evidence of everything he had worked for and the knowledge that it would continue after him. Jane received the news by telegram from Ruth Alderman and rode out with Calvin the following morning. They buried Thomas Baker on the eastern slope of his property, near the trees he had planted, in ground that belonged to him in every sense of the word. The service was attended by the Aldermans and 3 other neighboring families and Reverend Howard, who had ridden the distance from Laramie, and it was quiet and right in the way that good endings are. Jane stood at her father's grave for a long time after the others had gone to the house. Calvin stood beside her. The winter light was low and white, and the grass was pale, and the trees on the slope were bare. She said nothing for a while. He did not try to fill the silence. She said eventually, "He got to see it. Everything he planted, he got to see it take." Calvin said, "He did." She said, "I am glad I came in time." He said, "You always come in time." She said, "I did not know that about myself until I had a reason to test it." He said, "I know, but it was always true." She turned and looked at him. His face in the winter light was honest and steady and familiar in the way that things become familiar when you have loved them long enough that the familiarity is itself a kind of beauty. She said, "I am glad I walked into that land office." He said, "I am glad you argued with me." She said, "I was not arguing with you. I was citing regulations. He said, "That is the same thing," she said. "It is absolutely not the same thing," but she was smiling when she said it. He took her hand. They walked back toward the house where the aldermans had made food, and the two boys were being managed with what sounded like heroic patience, and the smoke from the chimney rose straight into the still winter air, and the land was solid under their feet. Thomas Baker's homestead was formally transferred to Jane Baker Reed in the spring of 1885, completing the legal process that Ruth Alderman helped initiate, and Calvin handled the documentation for with characteristic thoroughness. The Baker claim, now Reed land along with the adjacent property they had claimed, made their combined holdings substantial enough to be a working operation of real consequence, which they managed with the same partnership and precision they brought to everything. Jane was admitted to the Wyoming Territory bar in 1886, one of the first women to achieve that status in the territory, joining a very small company of women across the American West who had pushed through the barriers of a legal profession that had not been designed with them in mind, and who had found that the barriers, while real, were not impenetrable to a sufficient combination of knowledge, persistence, and the particular refusal to accept the word no that is common to people who have always known their own worth. The morning she received her certificate of admission, Calvin was in Cheyenne for an office meeting. She read the letter at the kitchen table with Thomas James, now 6 years old, eating breakfast beside her, and Daniel George, 4 years old, constructing something architectural out of biscuits on the other side of the table. She read it twice. She set it down. She looked at the window at the April morning outside, the grass coming green, the cottonwood trees on the north side of the property beginning to leaf. Thomas James said, "Mama, what does it say?" she said. "It says that I am a lawyer." He considered this. He said, "What is a lawyer?" she said. "Someone who makes sure that the rules are applied correctly to protect people who need protecting." He said, "Like what you already do." She said, "Yes, exactly like that, but now it is official." He went back to his breakfast with the equanimity of a child for whom his mother's extraordinary competence was simply the normal fabric of the world. When Calvin came home that evening, she met him at the door. She held up the certificate. He read it. He set down his bag. He said her name, which was the word he said when he had too many things to say any of them. She stepped forward and he put his arms around her and held her, right there in the doorway with the spring evening around them, and she let him. She said, into his shoulder, Thomas James asked what a lawyer was. I told him someone who makes sure the rules are applied correctly to protect people who need protecting. He said, "That is the best definition I have ever heard," she said. "He said it was like what I already do." He laughed. He said, "Smart boy," she said. "He takes after his father. He pays attention." He held her a moment more. Then he said, "We should celebrate." She said, "I have already made a pie." He said, "Of course you have." She said, "Cherry, from the last of the preserves." He said, "Jane Baker Reed, attorney at law who also makes cherry pie." She said, "Do not be smug about it." He said, "I am not smug. I am overwhelmed with admiration and also somewhat hungry." She laughed and went back inside, and he followed her, and the door of the house on the rise closed behind them both, and inside was the warmth of the stove and the voices of their sons and the smell of the pie cooling on the counter, and outside the spring evening settled into the grassland, and the first stars came out one by one above the hills that had been there before them and would be there after them, indifferent and beautiful, as the West always was. Years would pass, as they do, adding themselves one to the next with the particular texture of a life that is genuinely lived. More clients for Jane, cases won and a few lost, and every one of them treated with the full weight of her attention. More careful supervision for Calvin, corruption rooted out and process reformed, and a generation of younger clerks trained in the correct way of doing things, which he considered the most important part of the work. Thomas James growing into a tall, observant boy who loved horses and mathematics in equal measure, and showed every sign of his mother's capacity for sustained focus and his father's capacity for honest dealing. Daniel George rounder and more sociable than his brother, with a laugh that filled whatever room he was in, and a natural talent for making people feel at ease, which in 1888 at age 6 he deployed primarily on his parents, and the aldermans, and the family of a neighboring homesteader who had 3 children near his age, and who had become something very close to an extended family. In the winter of 1889, Jane told Calvin she was fairly certain the 3rd bedroom was going to need to be revisited. He looked at her across the breakfast table. He was 43 years old. She was 39. He said, "Fairly certain," she said, "considerably certain, very." He said, "Jane," she said, "I know." He came around the table and took both her hands and stood there with the winter light coming through the kitchen window, and she looked up at him, and both of them were aware of time in the way that people become aware of it when they have had enough of it to know what it means. He said, "Are you well?" she said. "I am very well, tired in the mornings again, but well." He said, "Good." He pressed his lips to her forehead, which he still did, which she still permitted. "Good." The 3rd child arrived in July of 1889, the summer that Wyoming Territory formally petitioned for statehood, which Jane considered an appropriate coincidence. It was a daughter, which surprised them both, and which Thomas James, now 9, accepted with the grave seriousness of a boy calculating the strategic implications. Daniel George said she was very small and could she stay. They named her Margaret for Jane's mother, the woman who had not lived to see the house on the land that Thomas Baker built, and who lived anyway in everything Jane was. Margaret Catherine Reed arrived in the world with her mother's dark eyes and her father's habit of looking at things with complete attention, and she did not cry much, which the midwife said was unusual, and which Calvin said was simply evidence of character. Thomas Baker's land and Calvin's land together, formally combined under one family deed in 1887, now encompassed over 700 acres of Wyoming grassland. They ran cattle on part of it, leased grazing rights on another portion to a neighboring operation, and kept the home acres as they had always been, a place built by intention and maintained by love and characterized by the particular quality of a household, where 2 people of equal intelligence and mutual respect have chosen to build something together. Wyoming became the 44th state of the Union in July of 1890. Jane had written a piece about it for the Denver legal publication, noting that Wyoming had been the first territory to grant women the right to vote in 1869, and was now becoming a state with that right intact, which was not a small thing in a country where most women still lacked it. Calvin read the piece at his desk, and then left it on the kitchen table where anyone who came through might read it, which was his quiet way of saying he was proud. She found it there with his coffee cup beside it when she came downstairs in the morning. She picked it up. She looked at his handwriting on the corner, the words simply "good work" in his precise clerk's hand. She set it back down. She went to make coffee. She thought about a land office in the summer of 1878, hot and dusty, a counter between them and a document on the counter, and a man who picked up his pen when she asked him to. She thought about the word home, and how it had grown to contain so many specific and irreplaceable things that it was no longer a simple noun but an entire landscape, lit by the particular light of a life that had been chosen deliberately and lived without reservation. Calvin came downstairs. He saw the piece on the table. He looked at her at the stove. She said without turning, "Good work is high praise from you," he said. "It is the most accurate description." She said, "I know. That is why I liked it." He said, "Coffee," she said, "nearly ready." He sat down at the table. From upstairs came the sounds of Thomas James and Daniel George beginning their morning, and then the smaller sound of Margaret making the purposeful commentary of a 1-year-old who has opinions about the fact that she is awake, and no one has acknowledged it yet. Both of her parents heard this, and Calvin stood up first and went up the stairs to retrieve her before she escalated, and came back down with her tucked against his shoulder, her dark eyes already sharp and interested, looking at everything. He set her in the high chair. She regarded the kitchen with the focused assessment of someone conducting an inspection. Jane set a cup of coffee in front of Calvin and looked at her daughter and said, "Good morning." Margaret responded with a sound of unmistakable authority. Jane said, "Yes, exactly." She poured her own coffee and sat down, and the morning opened around them, practical and warm and full, as all their mornings were. Outside the window, the Wyoming summer was beginning. The grassland rolled away from the house in every direction to the hills and the sky beyond. 700 acres of earned ground growing things, holding the weather and the seasons and the evidence of everything that had been built here by hands that knew what they were doing and hearts that meant it. It had started with a woman walking into a land office and refusing to be turned away. It had started with a man choosing to do the right thing because it was right. It had started, in the most precise and literal sense, with an argument about a federal regulation cited from memory across an oak counter in the summer heat of 1878. Everything that followed, every acre of it, every season of it, every child sleeping upstairs and every case won and every record kept correctly, was what happened when two people of genuine character find each other at exactly the right moment and have the sense to recognize it. Calvin looked across the table at Jane. She was reading something, a letter that had come in the previous day's mail, her coffee cooling beside her hand, her dark eyes moving steadily across the page with the absorption she brought to everything that interested her. The morning light was on her face. She was 40 years old, and she had always been the most interesting person in any room she entered, and she would be the most interesting person in any room she entered when she was 80, and he knew this with the certainty of a man who has had 12 years to observe a person with complete attention. She looked up and found him looking at her. She said, "What?" He said, "Nothing." "You," she said, "that is not a grammatically complete sentence." He said, "I know. I was thinking about that land office." She said, "Were you?" He said, "I think about it sometimes, how close it was. If you had come in the day before, it would have been Whitmore at the counter." She said, "I know. I have thought about that too." He said, "You would have found another way." She said, "I would have, but it would have been slower and harder and considerably less pleasant." She set down the letter. "And I would not have had this." She gestured a small gesture at the table, the kitchen, the house, the morning, all of it. He said, "Neither would I." She picked up her coffee cup. She said, "I am glad I walked in that door." He said, "I am glad every single day." Outside, the summer morning moved across the grassland in a long, easy light, and the house on the rise was warm, and everything in it was exactly where it should be. And the story of what had been built here was written not in any official record, but in the living fact of it, permanent and true, rooted as deep as the cottonwood trees on the north side of the property, which had been small when they came and were now, after all these years, casting real shade.